Hello and thank you very much for being here. And before we dive into the details of this presentation, I want to unpack what mixing efficiency of submesoscale centrifugal-symmetric instabilities means because it's a mouthful. And I want to start by defining submesoscales here, and I'm just defining them as flows that have Rossby and Richardson number relatively equal to 1. And submesoscales have been shown to be important for the global circulation and global dynamics. And a main reason for that importance is that some mesoscales are one of the major pathways through which energy can cascade down from large scales of the flow to the small scales of the flow, where it can finally leave the system. So if you have large and mesoscale structures here that have a lot of energy, these structures, especially the mesoscale structure, they excite submesoscale structures, submesoscale currents. So you can see those here as these small structures in this bottom figure. And those submesoscale flows, they become unstable to one or more instabilities, and then energy can cascade down to the micro and small scale of the flow, which are these ones here. And from then on, the energy can do one of two things. It can be dissipated, and then that energy is stored as internal energy of the fluid, or that energy can be used to irreversibly mix buoyancy of the flow, and then the energy is stored as background potential energy. So both these processes are irreversible, meaning once the energy leaves the system through these processes, it cannot come back. And I'm calling both these rates here epsilon k and epsilon p. And that allows us to define the mixing efficiency, which I'm calling gamma here. And the mixing efficiency is defined like this. And what it is it quantifies the amount of energy that was extracted from the flow that is used to irreversibly mix buoyancy. So that is what the mixing efficiency is. It's a quantification of how efficient the flow is in mixing buoyancy. And we know that some mesoscale instabilities, they affect the rate at which energy goes from the submesoscales to the small scales of the flow, but I also argue in this presentation that they can also control the rate at which energy goes to either kinetic energy dissipation and therefore to internal energy, or to background potential energy through irreversible mixing. And one example of some mesoscale instability that we're going to focus on is the centrifugal-symmetric instability. And I'm going to call it CSI here because otherwise it's a mouthful. So you're looking at vorticity at the top plot and buoyancy at the bottom one. And you can see that the instability is very explosive actually, and then it manifests itself as these counter-rotating cells here, these slanted cells that you can see around here. These cells don't have a lot of three-dimensional structure. They're mainly 2D, so they don't have a lot of structure in the direction coming out of the page. But you can see that there's a lot of turbulence superimposed onto these cells, three-dimensional turbulence, and you can anticipate that there's going to be a lot of dissipation and a lot of mixing of buoyancy there. And we actually have evidence for CSIs in nature. We have a lot of numerical evidence, but we also have some experimental evidence. So here I'm showing 3 different papers, one by Savelyev, Eric Rosario, and a group of papers that Garabato and Spinges were part of. And I advise you to go look at all these papers. These 2 on the left are evidence for CSIs in the surface boundary layer, but I'm going to focus on this one on the right, which has evidence for CSIs in the bottom boundary layer. And in fact, this paper shows evidence that CSIs happen in the Orkney Deep, which is a key location for the global overturning circulation because it is the start of the journey for the Antarctic Bottom Water. And in fact, the Spinges and others showed that at this location, possibly due to CSIs, we have higher than usual mixing efficiencies, which kind of underscores the importance of understanding these instabilities because they can be significant for the global overturning circulation and ocean dynamics in general. And just to give a brief overview of centrifugal-symmetric instabilities, we can start by defining the Ertel potential vorticity, which is defined here as it is usually defined. And if we assume that there's thermal wind balance, and we divide by the rotation frequency and the Brunt-Väisälä frequency, we have the normalized Ertel potential vorticity that I'm calling Q hat. and you can see that the Rossby and Richardson number appear here. And in summary, a flow is unstable to CSIs when Q hat is negative. And you can see that it can happen through the Richardson number being too small or the Rossby number being negative enough. And you can see, based on this definition and based on our definition of some mesoscales, why we think these instabilities are particularly active in the submesoscale range of the spectrum. There are two flavors kind of CSIs. If the Rossby number is what's doing most of the heavy lifting and getting Q hat to be negative, we say that centrifugal modes are dominating. And these instabilities, this flavor of CSIs, it seems like they're more common at bottom boundary layers. And if the Richardson number is doing most of the heavy lifting in getting Q hat to be negative, we say the symmetric modes are dominating, and these seem to be more common at the surface. And like I mentioned before, there is some evidence that the symmetric modes can have low mixing efficiency, and that centrifugal modes can be significantly more efficient at mixing fluid. And the first thing is we want to investigate that and see if that is actually the case. And if that is actually the case, we want to know why.
So to perform that investigation, I'm going to run a set of 3D large-eddy simulations. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but suffice it to say that these large-eddy simulations, they actually resolve a big portion of the turbulence that's responsible for the cascading of energy down to the dissipation scales, so we can actually learn something about the turbulence in the process. And these are the 11 simulations I'm going to run. They span the submesoscale range of the parameter space. So they're all plotted here in this picture. In the horizontal axis here, you can see 1 over Richardson number. In the vertical axis, it's the Rossby number. And each symbol here is a different simulation. Everything to the right of this dashed line is symmetrically dominated. Everything to the left of this line is centrifugally dominated. And if you actually run the whole simulation and you average out a representative value of the mixing efficiency, you get a picture like this one. So what I'm plotting here in the vertical axis is the mixing efficiency, and in the horizontal axis I'm plotting the horizontal shear production rate divided by the vertical shear production rate, and this is actually a measure of how symmetric versus how centrifugal a simulation is, a given instability is. And you can see right away that the points collapse really well into this line, which can be useful for parameterizations and to interpret observations. And I just want to emphasize here that as far as parameterizations go, generally most parameterizations that use the mixing efficiency to parameterize mixing, they use a constant canonical value, which is represented by this dashed line here. So this is the canonical value that represents the mixing efficiency of ocean turbulence in general, as you know the literature uses today. And we're showing here that actually CSI, so this sort of centrifugal instability, they can have mixing efficiencies that can range from much lower than that to much higher than that. So just underscoring the importance of understanding these sorts of instabilities. Now the natural question is why? If it is indeed the case that these instabilities can have much lower and much higher mixing efficiencies than one would anticipate, why is that? And for that we need to look at the equilibration process of these CSIs. So let's look here a little bit at the evolution of a CSI, of a given CSI. And I'm going to zoom in into a portion of time and space here, and we're going to analyze it out a little bit. So what you're seeing here is two counter-rotating cells that are part of this initial CSI that become stronger and stronger and stronger, and eventually you have the secondary instabilities that appear that look a lot like Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities, and those instabilities, as you can see here in these upper panels, they mediate the transition to full turbulence. And an analysis that we've done in the paper that's under review is to show that these instabilities, they actually are Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities, and this kind of corroborates the same work that Taylor and Ferrari have done, but only for symmetric modes. So we kind of expanded on that, and we showed that not only symmetric modes, but all the modes of CSIs apparently equilibrate via Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. which means that we can probably use that to organize our results a little bit. So in the Kelvin-Helmholtz literature, they talk about this parameter here called buoyancy Reynolds number, defined like this. And what we wanted to do is to plot the mixing efficiency as a function of the buoyancy Reynolds number in our simulations. So just as an illustration, the dissipation rate of kinetic energy looks like this in any given simulation of ours, and this is a snapshot, and the mixing of buoyancy also follows a similar pattern. And if we actually plot the mixing efficiency against the buoyancy Reynolds number, you get a pattern like this. So there's some noise here, a little bit of spread of the data, but you can clearly see a plateau here of constant mixing efficiency that goes from around 0.2 to 0.3. And after that, the mixing efficiency goes down with a slope that's roughly minus 1/2. And these results are actually very similar to results that were obtained by the Kelvin-Helmholtz literature, in which you do have this slope here, this minus 1/2 slope, and this plateau here. We just couldn't reach low enough buoyancy Reynolds numbers to get to this tail portion of it on the left-hand side, where results monotonically increase with increasing Reynolds number. But everything else is there. So how do we interpret these results? Let's come back a little bit to the zoom in that we did a few slides ago and analyze what's going on here again. So what's happening here is that there's the quiescent start. The CSI then starts to develop as these counter-rotating cells. The counter-rotating cells become stronger and stronger and stronger progressively until a point where the shear is large enough that these Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities emerge, right? And after that, there's the three-dimensional turbulence that ensues. And then after that, the three-dimensional turbulence starts decaying, but there's a lot of mixing and dissipation in the process. So the Kelvin-Helmholtz literature tells us that the mixing efficiencies of these overturning instabilities depend on three things mainly: the Pareto number, the buoyancy Reynolds number, which we just saw, and the Richardson number as well. Now, these CSIs, they actually control all these things indirectly. So the Reynolds number is controlled by stratification dissipation rate. CSIs control that, especially the stratification, because these counter-rotating cells might be bringing heavier fluid down and lighter fluid up. And the Richardson number as well, because the stratification again is being modified, but also the vertical shear, which is maybe the easiest one to visualize here, because the cells are getting stronger, the vertical shear is getting stronger as well. So what we think is happening here is that the CSIs are modifying all these properties in the background, and through that they end up controlling the mixing efficiencies of Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. And that is how different flavors of CSI, which have inherently different vertical shears and etc., they end up having different mixing efficiencies in the end. So finally, here are some takeaway messages from this talk. First, this is a clear example where the submesoscale flow controls a small scale turbulence, and I think I would argue that is interesting in and of itself. Second, CSIs end up controlling the background for overturning instabilities, which then ultimately perform the mixing. As a result, CSIs can mix at rates that are much higher or much lower than the standard value of mixing efficiency that is used throughout the literature to model ocean turbulence in general. Furthermore, this is an important connection with the stratified turbulence literature, and it actually opens the door for us to use more of that literature in the research that's to come. Lastly, CSIs can actually have significant implications for global dynamics. So we just showed here that CSIs can indeed mix a lot more than what one would think based on the canonical value of mixing efficiency. So if you look at the Spinge's paper, they actually did see that, so this sort of is in line with that result, qualitatively at least. And that specific location is again a very important location for ocean dynamics because it's the start of the Antarctic bottom water. It could modify global ocean dynamics in non-trivial ways if there's mixing there that we're not taking into account. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.